So, welcome to the second in our winter lecture programme. You may remember I said last time that if there was a theme, it was new perspectives on virtually everything. And last time we had Stephen Summerfield talking about new perspectives on the Convention of Sintra, which I suppose we could argue is the beginning of our interest in the Peninsular period. Now we're moving to the other extreme on the time continuum, as it were, which is looking at what happened after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, but from a different actual perspective. What was the impact of the Battle of Waterloo on the British psyche and polity? And I'm delighted that we've got here with us, joining us from the USA, from the University of Connecticut, Stamford campus, Dr. Luke Reynolds. Now, Luke originally has done papers on oral history in the Peninsular War, the British occupation of Toulouse. He wrote that in 2012, but he actually specialises on the impact of Waterloo and its commemoration. And it's very much, he's an expert on the cultural, social and military history of Britain and its empire in the long 19th century. Earlier this year, in August to be exact, his first book was published, Who Owned Waterloo? Battle, Memory, Myth in British History, 1815 to 52. And it has received rave reviews from such illustrious people as Rory Muir, who I know you all know, Alan Forrest, and Ron Chernow, who's a Pulitzer-winning prize author for his work on Washington, and Alexander Hamilton wrote the following about Luke. The book marks the debut of an historian of exceptional promise. It is not just an important work of history, but a vastly entertaining one. So, Luke, sir, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us from the other side of the pond. And how can I put this? The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, John, and thank you for having me. I've been a proud member of the Waterloo Association for, I think, about 5 years, but you know, once you hit the pandemic and go before it, time seems to lose all meaning. So it was some point in there. I'm just going to pull up the PowerPoint for us today. And John asked me to do the sort of impossible and summarize my entire book in one talk. I told this to my editor at Oxford, and his immediate response was, and 45 days later, Luke finally finished speaking to the Waterloo Association. I promise I will not speak for 45 days. I will just be limiting myself to the usual 45 minutes or so. But I've been thinking a lot about how to do this, and I think the best way, honestly, is just to go chapter by chapter and to talk about it a little bit. I do want to start with a little bit of a codicil, as John pointed out, and it may very well get me kicked out of the society. This book isn't actually about the Battle of Waterloo. It starts fundamentally on the 19th of June. Thank you. 1815. And goes from there up until Wellington's funeral in November of 1852. And fundamentally, my book explores how ubiquitous and multi-layered Waterloo became in British culture in those multiple decades. Examines a variety of events of cultural and social history to really explore that and to emphasize just how big a part that Waterloo played in the development of Britain's sort of national identity. And I know that's a phrase that gets thrown around quite a lot. But in this case, it is sort of, you know, a lot of stuff was based on that, and people kept looking back and back and back. A couple of things worth noting just to begin with. This is, I operate off of, in this book at least, a deliberately domestic definition of ownership, right? So the classic debates about whether it was the British, the Prussians, the Allies overall who won Waterloo, whether, you know, who controls the field, that sort of thing. That is of interest, but it is a domestic definition. I'm looking exclusively at Great Britain as it was then. So England, Scotland, Wales, and the entirety of Ireland. No disrespect intended to anyone currently living in the Great Republic. I also exclude at this point the Empire. That requires a work of its own, and hopefully that will be my next book, although it may go a little further beyond Waterloo as well, but there will definitely be some Waterloo in there. So that's sort of the first codicil. The second one is, okay, it's a snappy title, Who Owned Waterloo? But how do we define ownership in this context, right? And my book defines ownership as control of the battle's narrative and commemoration, and through that, the curation of Waterloo and the men who fought there in the nation's collective memory, right? So it's about the transfer from what is traditionally referred to in memory scholarship as communicative memory, which is sort of the memory that we all experience on a day-to-day basis, into collective or cultural memory, which is a much more enduring, but crucially, as I said, curated form of remembrance. And to give you a good example of this, drawn from Elida Assmann, but sort of focused on Waterloo, the way I view cultural memory is that it is what drives a guy by the name of Alfred Bate Richards, who's a British journalist and barrister, to declare in 1851 that we won Waterloo, despite the fact that he had never served in uniform and he had been born in 1820, 5 years after the battle, right? So but it's still very much we won Waterloo, as you know, sort of the same way you could argue that. You know, when we say we, when we talk about nations, when we talk about sports teams, that sort of thing, it's that level. Now, the chapters in this book are thematic. They each touch, they're organized that way, but they are also organized in a loose chronology. So the first 2 chapters begin moments after the end of the battle, and we sort of progress. And the last 2 chapters are interested in portions of Waterloo commemoration that are still to a certain extent with us, whether that's paintings, which we can, you know, see hanging in Apsley House and the Tate and things like that, or you know, sort of the name of a rail station, and even though it's not the original bridge, a bridge across the Thames in London. So let's start, rather, you know, sort of bucking all tradition, with chapter 1, which is about histories and memoirs, and sort of examining the written word as it applies to Waterloo. I don't talk about novels. There's a touch of it in another chapter, but fundamentally this is about nonfiction, right? So it's about overarching histories, and it's about military memoirs. And this chapter works on 2 different definitions of ownership, right? Fundamentally, so the first thing is right at the beginning, right as Waterloo wrapped up and right as it started to become popular in British culture, what I tend to refer to as Waterloo mania. Everyone worked together, the civilians writing the histories, the officers writing letters and things like that, which would eventually become memoirs. Everyone worked together to ensure that in the pages of British publications, you know, from the newspapers through the actual publications, that the populace saw Waterloo fundamentally as a British victory, not as an Allied victory, not as a Prussian victory, but as a British victory, to the point of even dismissing, as you are presumably all aware, at being members of the association, fully dismissing the contributions of, say, the Belgian and the Dutch troops, that sort of thing. So that was the first step in this, right? Establishing that national ownership. But once that was established and sort of taken as read, then a dichotomy starts to develop, where we see a split in how the battle is covered. Civilian authors start to dominate histories, classic, overarching, bird's eye view accounts of the battle and the campaign, right? And then Wellington did this, and then Napoleon did this, and then the Third Corps moved over here. That is almost exclusively dominated by civilian authors. Many, especially in the later period, drawing extensively on official reports, official documents, the Gazette, and eventually, of course, you know, Wellington's dispatches and things like that. The officers writing their memoirs, on the other hand, chose instead to issue overarching descriptions in favor of personal narratives, right? The two that are up on your screen, the title pages, the two that are up on your screen, Captain John Kincaid's Adventures in the Rifle Brigade in the Peninsula, France, and in the Netherlands, and Lieutenant Colonel John Leach's, or Jack Leach's, Rough Sketches in the life of an Old Soldier. The first of both of these men penned more than one book. If you read the sections on Waterloo, as many of you will have done, you will note that they deliberately sort of say, this is what I saw, and I can't speak about what was going on over the ridge or through the smoke because I couldn't see it. This is about what I experienced. That use of eyewitness accounts, personal narratives, I argue is a deliberate choice. It is sort of the reverse of what Paul Fussell has argued was used in the First World War, and sort of to distance authors from memoirs and things like that. This is the very nature of their limited eyewitness scope, emphasizes their presence on the battlefield and their personal contribution to the victory. So in this case, the lack of overarching narrative, the lack of an overall view, actually provides the bona fides for these authors, right? It says, I was here, I was there, and this is what I saw. And I will leave the overarching view to civilians who were not there, but who can gather all of the information and presumably produce a better narrative. There is some back and forth. Each of these authors, of course, has their own priorities and their own bugbears and things like that. Leach is particularly angry because of a series of plays and panoramas and models and things like that have, in his view, made it seem like the Scottish regiments, the Highlanders in particular, won the Battle of Waterloo single-handedly. And he has to go on his rants about how, no, it was not just the Scots, but also the Irish and the Welsh and the English soldiers, as well as the Allies. Kincaid leans more towards service branches, right? So he argues for the importance of the infantry over the cavalry, the traditional dichotomy and never-ending sort of feud between the service branches, mentioning, of course, the glorious service of the artillery, but saying that they were far outnumbered and therefore that was a significant problem. This also applies, of course, to the civilians, although less in terms of service rivalries, but more, again, influencing that British ownership side of things, right? That British ownership side of things, and in many cases dismissing, as I've said, others. And they have particular enemies, right? Some will go after the Prussians, some will go after the Belgians, some will dismiss the Dutch. The only ones who universally are sort of praised of not of English stock are, of course, the King's German Legion, which are fundamentally part of the British Army and under British control. And sometimes some of the other, the Nassauns or the Bavarians, the Hanoverians occasionally will get a decent mention. Also folded into this chapter is a discussion of Wellington's dispatch, as you can see from the print of David Wilkie's, the Chelsea pensioners reading the Gazette of the Battle of Waterloo. This is the print by John Burnett after David Wilkie, mainly because it was much cheaper to reproduce than the original David Wilkie, and talks a little bit about letters and things like that as well. The eyewitness trend actually fundamentally continues into chapter 2, although there it is less about the soldiers and more about civilians as we move into battlefield tourism, relics, and physical ownership of the field. And here I argue that Waterloo plays a huge part in the rediscovery of the continent after the opening back up of it in 1815, right? An entire generation of Britons have not been able to travel to the continent because of Napoleon and the continental system and the blockades and wars and things like that. So as first in 1814 briefly, and then more permanently in 1815, that travel starts again. And it's not just aristocrats and the traditional grand tour, but we start to see the emergence of middle-class tourism, middle-class travel. And Waterloo plays a very significant role in that. It helps that it is very close to English shores. It helps that there is a modern, thriving city in the form of Brussels, relatively close to Waterloo itself, and that is the base from which to travel. But it becomes part of the British world on the continent. It becomes part of the great British pilgrimage, as it says there in the chapter title. And that plays into it, right? It becomes a pilgrimage site. Waterloo Village Church becomes a pilgrimage site almost to the level of, say, St. Paul's or Westminster Abbey, and certainly of a level that any scholars of Catholic religious history would recognize from more traditional views of pilgrimage in religious history. And from there, they visit the battle. They, of course, visit the grave of the Marquis of Anglesea's Leg. They see the Waterloo Elm, the Wellington Elm. They move through Hougoumont, and various numbers of guides, poems, memoirs of travel shape their expectations until there is fundamentally also an accepted and understood way to do Waterloo. There is a traditional guidebook, right? It is the way you do it. You start in Brussels, you go to Waterloo Village, then you go to the field, you end up, you visit Hougoumont, and then you finally end up at La Belle Alliance, and you continue on from there. So it becomes a set way to do Waterloo. And with this also comes the expectations of doing Waterloo, both in the case of, this is what we expect and this is what we see. And we have accounts of people, walking around with histories and guidebooks and checking off their guides as they speak about this, right? Is this correct? Or are they pulling the wool over our eyes? But you are also expected to be able to talk about it. You are expected to be able to sort of show what is going on. And so part of it becomes not just visiting Waterloo, but being seen to visit Waterloo. And this leads to the emergence of performative tourism, whether it is carving your name or your initials into the walls of the chapel at Hougoumont, or whether it is the collection of relics. Now on your screen, of course, is one of the most illustrious of those relics. That is an actual piece of the Waterloo Elm, the tree of observation. And it's a miniature relief carving of that tree made from the wood of that tree, laid down on mother of pearl, and carved with the details. But of course, people stripped portions of that elm, leaves, branches, things like that, to the point where they actually fundamentally killed the tree and it was eventually cut down. But it's not just that, it's grained from the farmyard at Hougoumont. It is the various ephemera of the battlefield, whether that is things like cap badges or musket balls, bones in often cases, right? We're familiar with the Victorian sort of obsession with the macabre, and that very much plays a part into this sort of what's been referred to as thanatourism, or tourism of death. Sometimes that is linked, right? We have accounts of widows coming to get their husbands' bodies and either reburying them or in some extreme cases, turning portions of them into decorative objects. But in many cases, it's just pieces that are of no connection to the individual person. And of course, the demand starts to slowly outstrip the supply until the village of Waterloo is basically making its fortune off of this tourism and off of the relic trade. And we do also have accounts that show that, especially in the later years, a lot of the relics that the British are buying and bringing home from Waterloo are in fact manufactured in the factories of Britain itself, shipped across, buried in the ground at Waterloo, then dug up and sold back to the British, which of course gives them an unwelcome but fundamentally unquestionable claim to ownership of that. Also, this chapter talks to a certain extent about ownership of the field, about who has the right and how that evolves to put up monuments, who changes that, right? Of course, the Lion's Mound, which is erected on the place where William of Orange, the Prince of Orange, is wounded, and becomes sort of this attempt at a Dutch national monument that is erected by fundamentally lowering Wellington's Ridge, so lowering the great hero to raise the Duke of Orange, the Prince of Orange, rather. And sort of that back and forth, and of course, veterans and tourists encountering each other on the battlefield and debating whether it was an English victory or Prussian victory or an Allied victory, and what was going on, and to a certain extent also explore the French relationship with the battlefield, because it is, for them, it is, as Victor Hugo put it, a sepulcher. It is a graveyard. It's a graveyard for all the nations who fought there. But for the French, it's also a graveyard of the dream of the 100 Days and the dream of the Napoleonic Empire. Moving back to Britain, fundamentally, chapter 3 explores what is probably the most common way that people experienced Waterloo commemoration, and that is annual commemorations. And annual commemorations underwent a fundamental change over the sort of 30-something odd years that my book discusses, because they start as one would expect, right? As, the first commemorations of Waterloo, of course, happen when there is only one Waterloo veteran in London. He's the man who brings the news. He brings Wellington's dispatch, and the word races out from the prince's party. And, there is mass celebrations. We have new charities being raised. We have new formation dances being done. When the first anniversary shows up in 1816, a large portion of the British army that had fought the battle is still, of course, in France. It's part of the army of occupation. And so that they don't experience it. So it evolves. And once they come back, we start to see the feting of veterans, the feting of regiments that served. There are things like reviews where every regiment that fought there, their standards are bedecked in laurels, and everyone who fought there wears laurel on their cap or on their sleeve. But slowly, that commemoration begins to change, and part of that is prompted by the army itself, right? The image on the left of your screen is William Heath and Thomas Maclean's The Glorious 18th of June from 1830. Obviously, glorious in this case being a somewhat ironic use. It's two very drunk soldiers tottering home after celebration after celebration after celebration. And as you can see, they are the worse for drink. They are not comporting themselves with the dignity that perhaps the army in general would like people to comport themselves with. And this pressure starts to separate the civilian and the military spheres. And so we start to see Waterloo commemorations on the 18th of June that in no way involve military men whatsoever, right? There are masquerades, there are balls, there are celebrations that are fundamentally civilian curated, civilian attended, and have no direct connection to Waterloo. It also becomes a way for performative patriotism to be displayed by villages, by towns, by cities, and to show up their great rivals, right? The other towns, there's always intertown rivalry. And, these towns look at each other and they see how they're commemorating it and they push to up one another. It becomes a very common day to hold other festivals, other feasts. It becomes effectively a feast day or a saint's day, or what we would refer to these days, of course, as a bank holiday. And as it slowly begins to evolve into that more traditional sense, it loses some of its Waterloo meaning. So we have examples of railway openings, canal openings, livestock fairs that are held on Waterloo Day annually, but have no direct connection to the battle itself. At the center of annual commemoration, two events fundamentally emerge as the sort of civilian and military side of this. The civilian is the Vauxhall Waterloo Fete, which becomes sort of the standard in terms of grand civilian celebration. It does eventually involve theatrical reenactment, but it actually starts as effectively an outdoor promenade with hundreds of thousands of tens of thousands of lanterns, usually displaying military shapes or transparencies. Sometimes there are panoramas and things like that, and that runs for nigh on 30 years. The military side is, of course, Wellington's Waterloo Banquet, which is actually fundamentally what got me into this entire endeavor, was researching and talking about the banquet. On the right-hand side of your screen, you will see the menu for the 1839 banquet, the only menu that we have extant, thankfully translated by Apsley House. The original menu, rather delightfully, is in French, prepared by Wellington's French chef. It is a grand event. And it was military only. The only civilians that were ever invited to this event were Wellington's son and Prince Albert, or the king, right? And there's a debate about, sort of they all held military rank, and what level of or do they qualify as civilians? But those are the only people that do not serve at the battle that are ever invited to this. It is an elite, all-male military gathering made up of veterans. But even this starts to become co-opted by the civilian sphere. It becomes a national spectacle. People gather outside of Apsley House on June 18th to watch everyone arrive. It's breathlessly reported in the newspapers, and actually the details and the reports get more extensive as we get further and further away from the battle. It reaches its height in sort of the 40s. Huge events, speeches are recorded. Obviously, there's toasts in very strict order of rank, depending on which portion of the service you're in. So, of course, the guards come first, and then the cavalry, and then the infantry and the artillery and things like that. And it goes on from there. But these are it's a strictly military event. But as I said, we're seeing the civilians sort of co-opted, and this also happens with reviews, right? There are often reviews on Waterloo Day of regiments of soldiers, and civilians start to treat this as entertainment, that it's there for their delectation. It's not really fundamentally about honoring the soldiers. It's about getting to watch them go through their maneuvers. And we see sort of, that idea of military pomp as entertainment that will, of course, evolve into things such as the Royal Edinburgh Tattoo, the Royal Tournament, back when that was still going on in London, and all of that. The transition from the military to the civilian continues in chapter 4, which is on exhibitions. And exhibitions are fundamentally how Waterloo is brought to Britain, right? Because yes, there is a significant amount more travel going on to the continent at this point than before the Napoleonic Wars, especially, as I said, with the burgeoning middle class, but it is still an expensive thing to do. And so exhibitions are a cheaper way to bring Waterloo to the populace, right? And exhibitions fundamentally take two forms. There are relic exhibitions, and there are display exhibitions. Relic exhibitions are what's represented by the caricature on the left hand of your screen. This is, of course, Crookshanks, a scene at the London Museum Piccadilly, or a peep at the spoils of ambition taken at the Battle of Waterloo, being a new tax on John Bull. Napoleon's carriage became the hit of the season. Everyone wanted to see it, and it raised an enormous amount of money for William Bullock, the manager of the London Museum in the Egyptian Hall on Piccadilly. Relic exhibitions had one very significant advantage to them. Their bona fides, their accuracy was built in, right? The relics are there. You've got everything you need. Napoleon's coach is right there. You've got other examples that pull in, sort of Légion d'honneur, various crucifixes, things like that, cap badges, swords, muskets from the battlefield. And all of that is the bona fides, the legitimacy, as I said, is built in, much as we still regard sort of museum exhibitions as that way. The problem, of course, is that is an inherently limited supply, especially when there are also huge numbers of tourists trying to buy up as many relics as they can. So relic exhibitions are not fundamentally infinitely reproducible. Display exhibitions, however, are. And display exhibitions are things like what's on the right of your screen, the panorama of Waterloo in Leicester Square. There were a number of Waterloo panoramas, both traditional, fully in the round, and peristropic panoramas, which are effectively moving rotating panoramas of the type that, if you want to, a more modern example, think about how they used to film driving in old school Hollywood Golden Age films, right? They had the two turning things that move the scenery. That is a peristrophic panorama, and they had scenes. Those are infinitely reproducible. Of course, the other great example of this that's not a panorama is William Seiborn's model of Waterloo. But these require a certain amount of proof of legitimacy, proof of bona fides, proof of accuracy. And here we find the officer corps stepping into that breach. They become, with their presence, with not just so much as sort of writing reviews, but simply showing up, with gracing their presence, they become the arbiters of these events. They show up, and by being there, they fundamentally say, no, this is accurate. This is how I remember it. This is an accurate portrayal, right? So both the peristrophic panorama that Messrs. Marshall and the panorama in Leicester Square both see the Duke of Wellington attend. They see the Marquis of Anglesey attend. And they've advertised these facts, right? This newspaper ads for these events afterwards sort of say by appointment of the Duke of Wellington, that sort of thing. They rise out of that, and they use that as their statement of accuracy. So they are infinitely reproducible, but they are to a certain extent more limited. They are required to work with officers to follow what they view as the accurate depictions of the battle. And that is, of course, where the sad story of William Seiborn comes in, who many of you are also familiar with, who pours his life and soul and heart into creating what many consider to be the most accurate representation of the Battle of Waterloo ever put onto 3D terrain. But because he chooses the climax of the battle, when the Prussians were on the field, and many officers, Kincaid among them, feel that he gives too much credit to the Prussians, and so there is pushback. There are people who criticize him. There are people who refuse to attend. Wellington in particular. Wellington openly never attends Seiborn and is asked later on in his career why he didn't, and he basically says, because my attendance would have granted authority to an event, to a depiction of this event that I don't feel was accurate. And so he deliberately withholds his attendance. So that is the other side of the exhibition, right? The relic exhibition is by definition automatically authentic. Some of them do actually have heavy support, right? Anglesey attends William Bullock's carriage. The other great relic exhibition, of course, is Madame Tussaud's, who eventually inherits Napoleon's carriage along with a bunch of other things. And Wellington is a huge fan of Tussaud's. He had a standing order to be informed when new models were going to be opened. And in fact, he is the only non-royal listed on the cover of the 1850 Madame Tussaud's catalog as a patron of the institution. But there is, of course, limited relics, whereas the representation, panoramas, models, things like that are in theory infinitely reproducible, but they do require authority. They do require others to say, no, this is what happened. This is accurate. And we see from that form a form of patronage, right, between the officers, especially the elite officers, and the civilians who are creating and curating these events. That patronage takes on more traditional aspects in Chapter 5, Grand Military and National Spectacle, or Waterloo on Stage and Canvas. All of you will be familiar with the image on the right. That is, of course, William Salter's Waterloo Banquet. And that painting is an excellent example of this, because it would have been impossible to do without Wellington's explicit backing. Right, it's Wellington that effectively writes letters of introduction for Seiborn and arranges for all but, I believe it's 2 of the sitters of that painting to be there, to actually sit in person for Seiborn, so he can gain the correct details of their uniforms, of their faces, of their postures. He's given full access to the portrait, to the picture gallery in Apsley House, to all of the decorations, the centerpieces, the tables, things like that. And he can paint all of that from life because he has the approval and the patronage of the Duke of Wellington. We see the same thing occur with, for example, Sir Thomas Lawrence's painting of Wellington in the costume he wore at the battle. Wellington actually ships his favorite charger, Copenhagen, back to London so that Lawrence can paint Copenhagen from life, along with the right trappings and things like that. So we fundamentally see that more traditional form of patronage, not so much in the direct money, although that does sometimes occur, but in the ensuring that these artists are granted access to things. Wellington, even before Salter, does the exact same thing with Jan William Pijnman, the great, who produces eventually the giant portrait, the group portrait at Waterloo that is now in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. But this isn't just about canvas, it's also about stage. And on your right, on your screens, you will see the frontispiece for Pollock's characters and scenes in the Battle of Waterloo. This is the toy theater version of one of the great theatrical successes of the 19th century, which is Astley Royal Amphitheatre's hippodrama of the Battle of Waterloo, which becomes so popular that it is routinely revived for the anniversary. It takes precedence over whatever is there. And we even have occasions where more modern events are sort of pushed aside, right? We have an example of a hippodrama of the Battle of Navarino that is going gangbusters and doing very well, being pushed aside because people want Waterloo again. They sort of see Navarino and they go, this is a great battlefield spectacle, a naval battle, and of course in the case of Navarino, but we want our favorite back. We want the classic back. We want Waterloo back. And so this is another way that people gain a different view of the battlefield. And again, it's one where the officers play their part. They attend. Wellington attends the hippodrama multiple times, as does Anglesey, as do others. And once again, they allow their names to be associated with it. Astley's is very boastful when they show up, that they enjoyed it and that they said it was accurate. Whereas others, more lesser officers, of course, also do attend and write to friends and family saying it is accurate and, it's remarkable and good fun and things like that. So stage and canvas see a much more traditional form of patronage, where the officers are using their clout, they're using sometimes they're using their money, sometimes they're using their contacts, and often they're using their very presence to say, this is an accurate representation of the battle that I approve of. And by doing that, they are, of course, filtering, they're curating those representations to be what they want to see, right? They are, in a way, using their influence to shape how the battle is being remembered, not so much by writing memoirs, not so much by writing histories, but by their presence and by pushing people one way or the other towards different approaches. My favorite example of this is, of course, the Jan William Pijnman, where it's a vast group portrait. There are several Frenchmen in it. There are several Duke of Oranges in there. There's Nassauans and Brits. There is not a single Prussian in that painting, even though it is supposed to take place at the end of the battle when the Prussians had arrived. You can understand, all of you would be familiar with the whole debate about whether to call it Waterloo and La Belle Alliance, and how Wellington tweaks that for his own gain. So you can see how he would approve and push all of this stuff as well. Moving on from grand military and national spectacle, we come to what is probably the most democratized and the least challenged form of nationalization of commemoration, and that is monuments and material culture. When I started researching this chapter, I was stymied because there are actually very few old school traditional monuments to Waterloo on British soil. There are lots of monuments to Wellington, there are monuments to other men who fought there, but there aren't traditional monuments to Waterloo. And I was stuck. And then I realized that this is not actually a problem, this is an opportunity. Because by moving away from the more traditional definition of monuments, a whole new world opens up, right? On your left, you will see the opening of Waterloo Bridge, 1817, attended by His Royal Highness the Prince Regent, His Royal Highness the Duke of York, and of course the Duke of Wellington in a grand military spectacle. From that, we see the emergence of Waterloo Place. We see the emergence of Waterloo as a name for streets, for houses, for businesses, pubs, hotels. There's a Waterloo Glass House, there's a Waterloo Brewery, there's a Waterloo Baths, there's a Waterloo textile mill. It becomes so ubiquitous that Jane Austen, in her unfinished novel Sanditon, actually has one of her characters lament that they named their newly built house Trafalgar House because, and I quote, "These days Waterloo is much more the in thing." But that character consoles himself with the fact that we have Waterloo in reserve for a nice little crescent that is currently being built, and there were several Waterloo crescents. This form of commemoration, this form of nationalization, as I said, is virtually unchecked. There is no pushback. It becomes civilian in every way, without any attempt, largely on the part of the officers, on the part of others, to push back against it. And it's not just in terms of grand structures or even utilitarian structures. And note, by the way, that when the bridge opens and further things like that open, the British press is very quick to point out that they are celebrating their victories with important things like bridges and roads, utilitarian things, rather than vain and pompous towers and temples, looking very squarely across the English Channel to France and things like the Arc de Triomphe and things like that, very, very conveniently ignoring things like the Pont de Jena and the Pont de Austerlitz. But it's not just about large structures, it's also about people, it's about the home, right? And people all want, a lot of people want to celebrate this. And so we see material culture on a more individual level start to emerge. On the right-hand side of your screen is a Wellington door knocker, created by a blacksmith and the inventor of a patent shower system, and sold a huge success right across the 18-teens into the 1820s. There are others. There's a Waterloo blue that becomes hugely popular in paint, in clothes, in cloth. The Lord Mayor of London's coach is at one point redone in Waterloo blue. It's used as for banners for certain Waterloo veterans running for Parliament. We have Waterloo board games. We have Waterloo puzzles. We have, of course, endless maps and books and things like that. Huge collections of medals, such as Moody's medal collections, as well as, of course, the more traditional state-sponsored ones, things like the Waterloo Bridge Medal and, of course, the Waterloo Medal itself. The Waterloo Bridge Medal, by the way, is made out of the excess silver from the Waterloo Medal. From medals, it becomes even more absurd, right? Shades of blue are pretty high up there, but there's Waterloo snuff. There's at least 3 different varieties of flour named after Waterloo. There's a variety of legume named after Waterloo, a cherry tree. So it does expand and it becomes more and more democratized, right? The military has no ability, no desire nor ability to curate this in any way, partially because a Waterloo tree or a Waterloo street doesn't particularly say one way or another if the Prussians were there or anything like that. But it is fundamentally a more national, a more democratized form that, along with especially the annual commemorations and the use of June 18th as a bank holiday, fundamentally start to strip Waterloo as a term and as a date of some or all of its traditional meaning. Right. So, and we can see this to this day. There are people in London who, if you say Waterloo to them, will automatically think of the train station before the train terminus, before they think of the battlefield, the same way they'll think of the bridge, that sort of thing. The train station, by the way, is not actually named for the battle. It's named for the bridge and the road that goes across the bridge. It was originally Waterloo Road Station or Waterloo Bridge Station, and evolves from there. All of this comes to a conclusion in my book, in the epilogue, the conclusion, The Last Great Englishman is Low, and the funeral of the Duke of Wellington. And in this funeral, we see every aspect of Waterloo commemoration, of these battles, of this pushback, brought to the fore. It is a vast and huge spectacle. It was conceived by Prince Albert, who helped organize it, as a great exhibition in mourning, right? Another way to show off Britain. Its procession involves every aspect of British high society. It, of course, starts in Horse Guards, moves through the parks that people promenaded in, went past both St. James Palace and Buckingham Palace, goes past Apsley House, through Clubland and Pall Mall, then through the Strand, and finally into Ludgate Hill and the city. So all of this before ending up, of course, in St. Paul's Cathedral, where Wellington is lowered into the crypt directly on top of Nelson's tomb, where he rests for over a year while they build Wellington's tomb itself, and then is moved into his own tomb in the crypt. But as I said, every aspect of the commemoration that I've talked about is present. We see new and updated and reissued memoirs and histories. We see a drive to tourism, not just to Waterloo, but now to St. Paul's, right? And we see the residents of London taking exactly the same opportunities for people arriving in London as the residents of Waterloo Village do to people arriving in their village. Various forms of annual commemoration are not so much trotted out again, but are represented, are remarked upon. There are various discussions of, for example, the great Waterloo banquets that Wellington held, and the hippodrama and the Vauxhall Gardens. Exhibitions are trotted out again. The Waterloo panorama, the second one, the first one is destroyed by damp, but the second one that's made from the same sketches is put on display for the last time. Madame Tussauds brings in a brand new waxwork of the Duke of Wellington and creates a shrine to Wellington. Various versions of panoramas and peristropic panoramas and scenes are added to Wellington's life and things like that. There are, of course, more paintings, more publications that emerge, and material culture again takes the form of Wellington and Waterloo memorabilia, whether it's busts, paintings, bits of correspondence, clips from his hair in Copenhagen's, a waistcoat that he wore, and even such abstract things as Wellington funeral cake and Wellington funeral wine, both of which are advertised in the pages of the London Times. So all of this comes together to sort of fundamentally demonstrate, at least I argue, that there is this overarching, it's not an obsession, but it is a mania, and it becomes a normal part of British life to mark Waterloo in one way or another. But as it becomes more and more normal, it loses meaning. Waterloo quite literally becomes a household name, right? It becomes a street name, it becomes a bridge name, it becomes a station name. June 18th becomes the day that we always have this cattle fair, that we always use to open certain things. And so it rises beyond the battle itself to become a fundamental part of national culture. I will leave it there. I can see we have some questions that I am looking forward to grappling with, but I did want to, just as a final treat and a bit of shilling, which I hope you will forgive, this is a OUP flyer for my book, if you are interested, if this has sort of whetted your appetite. And if you order via OUP.com and use that code AAFLYG6, you will save 30% on the price. I know it is an academic hardback, so it is expensive. Also, for those of you who possibly can't afford that but are still interested, there will be a paperback emerging in 2023, hopefully right around June 18th. Can't imagine why I chose that day, but it seemed appropriate. All right. Yes, John, back over to you.
Absolutely fantastic, Luke. Thank you so much. Brilliant tour de force. And can I just repeat the actual promotion code to people? You'd have to go for OUP. So AAFLYG for Gordon 6. And we look forward to that. Can I just ask you a question? We've got questions coming in all over the place, but I just want to ask one question. Did the Duke of Wellington's death lead to basically people turning around and saying, right, after we've done a recommemoration, is that the end? Does Waterloo then tail off, or does it still keep on going?
No, it does. It does tail off, and it's a double whammy. It is sort of a 1-2 punch. It is very much Wellington's death, and then almost immediately after Wellington's death, right within a couple of years, Britain is at war in the Crimea, and the French are allies. And there are actually accounts. There are newspapers basically saying we can't celebrate Waterloo because the people we beat are fighting by our sides in the Crimea. This is politically a really poor look, right? So it does start to tail off, and it then starts to come back a little bit once we get past that in the abstract, when we get to anniversaries. So in 1890, there's a 75th anniversary panorama. There'll be a chapter about that I have written that will be out in a collection in the spring, not to toot my own horn yet again. And then, of course, there is a large amount of talk for the 100th, the centenary, which is, of course, slightly sidelined by the whole World War I thing, which, of course, then makes the 200th in 2015 huge, because that's really the first fundamental one of those that they can sort of go for. But yeah, Wellington's death does fundamentally end this as a sort of annual tradition.
Super. Let me pick up some of the questions on the chat section you've alluded to. So one from Gareth Glover. Excellent talk, Luke. Thank you. Have you looked at the Dutch, Belgian, Prussian attitudes and legacy of the battle over the same period? Did they do anything similar, or is this just us?
No. Thank you, Gareth, and thank you also for all of your books. I have about 5 of them on my shelf. At least 5.
I was going to say only 5. Yes.
I was going to say, yeah. No, they fundamentally they do some of this stuff. Britain takes it to an extreme that none of the others do, but they all do it. Prussia, of course, does a little bit, but Prussia's big one is Leipzig. Leipzig is the one that liberates Germany, or Prussia, and that's their big one. And actually, Waterloo starts, or La Belle Alliance starts to get a little bit political. Because a lot of the regiments that fight at La Belle Alliance end up being part of the sort of push towards reform in Prussia in the 20s and 30s. And so that gets sort of tailed off, and Leipzig gets raised once again in its place. For the Dutch, this is very much a matter of monarchy. That's the word I'm looking for. It's dynastic. Right, the House of Orange recognizes Waterloo as a possible way to sort of bring Belgium and the Netherlands together. Right, we're all in one. Let's all celebrate this. So yes, there are fireworks on the anniversary. There is, of course, the there's the battlefield itself. There's things like that. That tails off obviously after the Belgian Revolution. Belgium has a more complicated history with it because, of course, Belgium is sort of divided in terms of Francophone and Dutch-speaking, and they both look the other way, right? So the Francophone tends to look more down towards France, not down on France, but down towards France, and the Netherlands side looks up. And so there is that dichotomy there. And France has its own problems. Yes, it does. All of these countries have their own problems, but France has its own issues in terms of commemorating this, because it is a great defeat. In France, what it actually ends up being is a sort of pushback between. It becomes a way to honor the individual soldier, right? The sacrifice of the Republican soldier in general, the people, rather than any great leader. And actually, it becomes something of a battleground between those who view the Napoleonic Wars in general as a colossal mistake, and Napoleon is sort of a tyrant, and those that see him as the great man and the man of the future. And how to commemorate Waterloo becomes a way to push back and forth on that within France itself, right? Along with things like the myth of the Mont de Cambronne and all of that plays into that. I will just plug this a little bit as well. Alan Forrest's book Waterloo, it's the great battle series in OUP, actually takes this approach as well and goes to a certain extent through nation by nation. And if you want a little bit more than sort of the taste that I've given you of the international side, that's a very useful way to look at it.
Right, thank you. I've got a question or observation from Robert here. It says, it seems that they're mostly men who died at the battle were forgotten. Were there any ceremonies like today's remembrance at the cenotaph?
Not to that level. You know, the average soldier, there is no book of honor. There is no, you know, sort of the way that the names of the fallen are read at Ypres and Verdun and things like that. Some regiments had better records, but fundamentally it is all the officers that are remembered, and it's individuals, and it's about their families and their friends honoring them. It's there is nothing to the level. Waterloo is very much the last of these before, because it's the Crimea that starts to push towards the democratization of commemoration, the democratization of war, that ends, of course, well, not ends, but that sort of reaches its apogee with World War I and World War II, and things like the cenotaph and Remembrance Day itself.
Thank you. I've got a question from Paul Grenier. Is there any attempt by the civilian authors of the campaign across 1815 to 52 to promote the role of the Allies, say, through the newspapers? So in other words, do the civilian authors try and mention various allies, or are they focused so much on creating what you said, the British mythology behind it?
They do. Most of the time when they mention them, it is in a negative context. They are ruthless, especially about the Belgians and the Dutch in the aftermath. There's one that refers to them as an understuffed pillow that collapses the minute anything touches it, but then when the danger disappears, comes back to its regular form. Are there individual authors that are looking for a more distinctive view? Absolutely. And again, this is what causes Cyborn to get into huge amounts of trouble, even though I will note that he makes comparatively little effort to contact Prussian officers and Belgian officers and Dutch officers compared to the British officers, where he sends out this massive letter writing campaign, the holdings of which are in the British Library and well worth reading. I think they're also in several books, probably with Gareth Glover's name on them, if I recall correctly. Well worth looking at. But yeah, so there are individual authors pushing back, but largely it is this effort to make Waterloo more British than anything else.
Right, I've got another question for Paul here, and he asked the question, Luke, does the Vauxhall event remain a, quote, respectable, end quote, event as the decades move on?
It does, actually. I mean, you know, Vauxhall's reputation with respectability is something that goes back and forth and very much depends on which part of Vauxhall you're in, whether it's the gaily lit bandstands or the dark back tree-lined alleyways, site of 1,000 Regency romance novels. But yeah, no, we have even the last Vauxhall event is in 1850. And the Duke of Wellington's own son and goes to that one. The 1849 one, the Duke of Wellington's daughter-in-law goes to it, escorted by Wellington. So yeah, no, it is still relatively respectable. And Vauxhall is still being used as sort of an event space by the well-to-do as we move forward. So, for example, in 1828, Wellington and his allies organize their own gala and fete at Vauxhall to raise money for Spanish and Italian refugees. So it does have that veneer of respectability. Although obviously it does get that, you know, there are accounts of sort of, we get to the end of it and people are like, why does this still exist? Why is this place still here? So yeah, but it, I think because it was a special Waterloo fete, it attracted probably a better clientele than the average Vauxhall Day would have done.
Great, thank you. Now, while I'm just waiting for any more questions coming in, I should have mentioned before that Luke is also visiting assistant professor at Stanford, University of Connecticut. So he's marking scripts over Christmas, but then he's going down to, I think it's the American History Convention, and he's talking about a follow-up volume, may I say, with OUP. Would you like to share something more with us about that?
Yeah. So one of the comments that kept coming up when I was writing this book, and I knew it was going to come up, was, okay, what about the empire? Right? What about that? As we've just demonstrated, right? There's interest in the Prussian side, the French side, the Dutch side, but also what about the empire? And so the next book that I am currently researching, I won't say quite that I'm writing it yet, we're not quite there yet, but definitely researching, is going to be on imperial commemoration in the empire. It is going to look at Waterloo. I know, for example, for a fact, there's going to be a chapter on Waterloo commemoration in Australia. There's probably going to be another one on Waterloo commemoration in India. But I'm also interested in looking at quote unquote imperial victories in the metropole. So looking at things like Navarino, the 1857 rebellion, or the Sepoy Mutiny, however you want to name it, and possibly even taking that up to something like Mafeking Night, and sort of, you know, going from there. So yeah, that is the next book. And for those of you who are interested in sort of the more frippery side of this, there's also the new collection produced by the Society for Army Historical Research, edited by by Andrew Bamford. That has a chapter of mine in it on satire of Waterloo veterans in print and in both literature and caricature print media. So technically both of those are print, but sort of took a second to get. So yeah, if you're interested in that, there's also some. I've read the rest of the book, and there's some superb stuff across the entire time period. Well worth a read. Yeah.
Right. Well, listen, I'm just looking to see if there's any more. I don't think so. So I think on behalf of Waterloo Association, may I say, Luke,
we've got. I think a question just came in, and I'm more than happy to answer it.
Here we go then. So Nick Marchant, there's Nelson's column and plenty of pubs named after Nelson Trafalgar, but was there a similar kind of mass memorialization and celebration of the Battle of Trafalgar on a similar scale as Waterloo for decades afterwards?
Trafalgar memorialization remains much more military based, right? It is the Navy that marks Trafalgar every year. They still toast to it on those days. Trafalgar has the disadvantage of being slap bang in the middle of the war, right? We've got another 10 years of conflict going on. One of the things that makes Waterloo so special, and it's not fundamentally anything to do with the battle, not to dismiss anyone who fought there or died there, but that it is this sort of, this epic conclusion. And as humans, we are culturally bred to love that kind of thing, right? If you think about even modern film, modern books, right? All of that working towards that epic conclusion. Think how many times you've read a review of something that claims that it doesn't stick the landing, right? That the middle is the best part, but it dies off at the end. Waterloo is tailor-made to appeal to that. And so it does evolve out of that. There is absolutely Trafalgar stuff. We see a Trafalgar centenary, of course, in 1905. Actually, they take portions of the brass and copper from the victory and turn them into little brass badges of the victory that they hand out to sailors that participated in the commemoration of the centennial. So there are definitely similarities, but this is actually one of those very rare cases where the senior service is playing almost catch up to the army.
It's very true. I was wondering, I think they still do. Is it in Trafalgar Square on the Sunday closest to Trafalgar Day, where the Navy still do some form of presentation and a hoist the England expects? So perhaps the senior service will claim they might have the last laugh after all. I don't know.
I mean, yeah, there's certainly there is certainly. I mean, you can argue they have the last laugh because they have Trafalgar Square.
Yes, indeed. Indeed, they do.
Yeah.
Listen, Luke said, just look at all the wonderful positive comments that are coming in here. Thank you for a most fascinating talk, fascinating presentation. Gareth's an ex-naval person, so you know he's going to say that about the senior service, so we can accept that. But there we are. Luke, listen, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. I do hope we'll be able to sign you up for another of these talks when you get through to, say, the next book or even to an interim stage. Because this is an aspect we've not done before. Thank you.
I would deeply love to. It is my pleasure. I am at your beck and call. Just say the word.
I think all I need to do is just on behalf of us all, thank Luke again, but to say to you all the very best for a good Christmas and a healthy and peaceful new year. See you next year. Bye for now. Luke,
thank you so much.
Thank you very much
Thank
indeed.
you. Thank you for having me.